After the West collectively put its foot down on Russia with sanctions following Vladimir Putin's Ukraine invasion, Russia's president had to get sneaky. Using ships registered to Russia wouldn't work anymore. They could be tracked and, if necessary, stopped. But what about ships that hide their identities? Those that are difficult to track and have no direct links to Russia? That would work, and that's how the Shadow Fleet came to be. Russia has relied on this fleet, which often sails out of the Baltic Sea, to keep money flowing into its war chest, as it loses billions of dollars to the Ukraine war it started. Now, that's about to end. Putin is in big trouble as Denmark has just cut off Russia's Baltic Sea lifeline. Denmark's solution to the Shadow Fleet problem is brilliant. As TradeWinds reported on October 6, Denmark is planning to use a completely legal method to take Putin's Shadow Fleet vessels out of commission. It won't be sending fighter jets or launching missiles to sink those ships in the Baltic Sea. Instead, it's simply going to step up something that it's been doing all along to a point where Russia's shady ships won't be able to pass any longer. More ship inspections are going to sink the Shadow Fleet. Specifically, TradeWinds says Denmark is going to pour more effort and resources into conducting environmental checks on what it calls the old and worn-out ships at the Skagen Red anchorage. That anchorage is one of the key gateways for vessels passing to and from the Baltic Sea, the outlet says. According to the official Port of Skagen website, about 60,000 ships pass north of Denmark and through the anchorage every single year. This is a very active port. Russia has been taking advantage of that fact to sneak its Shadow Fleet ships through. This isn't going to happen anymore, as Denmark says that it's going to keep a closer eye on the ships that pass through the anchorage than ever before. Increased scrutiny of scrubber water discharge and fuel requirements is on the agenda, TradeWinds says. Denmark will also start paying even closer attention to how ships handle waste management, and it'll also improve its scrutiny of scrapping certificates. Basically, all of the signs that a ship could be part of the Shadow Fleet are now going to be on Denmark's radar. Theoretically, this should mean that many Shadow Fleet ships, which are often uninsured or otherwise unsuitable for conducting the journeys on which Russia sends them, will be caught and stopped before they can deliver the money-making oil cargoes to their buyers. The logic is very simple. Stopping the ships would mean cutting off the flow of money into Russia. Without money from oil, Russia may drown under the cost of a war that's believed to be costing the country around $1 billion per day. Denmark's Industry and Trade Minister, Morten Bødskov, announced the move by making it crystal clear that Denmark has the Shadow Fleet in its sights with its improved inspections. "We must put an end to Putin's war machine. This also applies to the Russian Shadow Fleet," Bødskov said. "We know from our safety checks at Skagen Red that among these ships there are old and worn-out ships sailing around. That is why our authorities are now intensifying the controls so that we look after Denmark in Danish waters." Funds have already been earmarked for the new inspections, which will also see more inspectors board vessels to enable the higher level of scrutiny promised. It's a move that is genius in its simplicity, and here's the reason why. When the West levied sanctions against Russian oil, it put much of Russia's existing fleet of ships out of commission. These ships were generally modern and seaworthy. They had the relevant insurance documents, and they were maintained to be a certain standard to ensure they abided by all international environmental laws. With those ships that are no longer able to sail, Putin resorted to the mass purchase of vessels he could use to form his Shadow Fleet. That alone was problematic enough. However, a major issue that often goes unreported is that many Shadow Fleet vessels are actively hazardous from the environmental and safety perspectives. Marine Insight revealed why in an August 2025 article discussing how the Shadow Fleet has been growing at a rate of about 30 ships per month. Shadow Fleet ships are over 15 years old and in poor condition with no proper insurance coverage. They sail under flags of convenience to hide their real ownership and use risky ways to evade being caught or detected, such as turning off AIS and performing dangerous ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, the outlet says. It's the part about the ships being 15 years old or more that's really relevant here. On average, oil tankers have lifespans of around 20 to 25 years, Vox reported in March 2024. That may seem like the Shadow Fleet ships are well within their sell-by dates. However, the outlet adds that the most reputable tanker operators tend to sell their vessels once they reach the 15-year mark. That's how Putin has been getting his hands on so many ships for the Shadow Fleet. These are tankers that their past operators no longer want because the maintenance burden is too high and it's more cost effective to run modern tankers than it is those that are starting to show their age. For Russia, tanker age isn't a problem. As long as a tanker isn't sinking, it can be part of the Shadow Fleet. While Putin may not care about the age of his shady oil tankers, the rest of Europe does. The older a ship gets, the more likely it starts to causing some serious environmental problems. Components start to degrade. The ship may not meet modern emission standards. And just think about what these tankers are carrying, gallons upon gallons of oil. It only takes one disaster, such as an aging tanker finally giving up the ghost midway through a journey, for a massive oil leak into the Baltic Sea or elsewhere to take place. These types of concerns have been around for a long time. In March 2023, Bloomberg published a piece in which it profiled an oil tanker named Turbo. At 26 years old, that vessel should have been sent to the scrapyard. It hadn't completed a full inspection since 2017, and it wasn't carrying the industry standard insurance for the job it was doing. But Putin was still using it, along with dozens of other ships that should have long since been taken off the water. The same outlet also highlights what was mentioned earlier about how tankers nearing the end of their lifespans become too expensive to maintain. Tankers normally receive inspections, known as special surveys, about every 5 years, Bloomberg says. By the fourth time around, the economics of continuing to trade diminish sharply. The surveys can cost $3 million to $4 million for big tankers, and they will then require an intermediate inspection about 2.5 years later. That's a lot of money to spend on inspections. Most reputable tanker owners replace rather than absorb that cost. Russia is doing neither. The almost inevitable results are already starting to appear. On October 6, TVP World reported that several of Russia's decrepit Shadow Fleet ships are already causing serious environmental problems. The outlet cites a joint report created by Politico and Source Material that says Russia is operating at least 5 blacklisted tankers that have been identified as leaving massive oil slicks behind as they sail the ocean. These slicks don't amount to a catastrophe, however, they show Russia's complete lack of regard for environmental protection and the safety of the crews aboard its shady ships. How long will it be before a Shadow Fleet vessel causes a major spill? Hopefully, it will never happen, but the signs are there that Putin is happy to keep sending out ancient ships until they literally can't sail anymore. The European Union, or EU, has a particular problem with this approach. Under the Fuel EU Maritime Framework, along with the Mediterranean's Emission Control Areas, or ECA, limits are being placed on ship emissions and carbon intensity. The former framework mandates that all ships achieve progressive reductions of their carbon intensity. These reductions will start at 2% in 2025, with the intention being that all ships sailing in EU waters will have achieved a reduction of 80% by 2050. The ECA limits ships' sulfur emissions to 0.1%, which is a standard that already exists in the Baltic and North Seas. The points here are simple. The EU wants to drive carbon emissions down, meaning it has an intense focus on the environmental aspects of shipping oil and cargo over long distances. With its Shadow Fleet, Russia is flat out ignoring frameworks designed to support these environmental policies. And that's where the brilliance of Denmark's inspections come into play. The country can justify the increased scrutiny under these EU and Mediterranean frameworks. Russia is left with no real recourse. If it tries to argue against the checks that Denmark is going to carry out, it essentially admits that the vessels most likely to be stopped belong to the Shadow Fleet. That defeats the purpose. Shadow Fleet ships, by their nature, aren't supposed to have any direct ties to Russia. So, Denmark can stop these old ships from sailing, and Russia can't say a direct word about it for fear of incriminating itself. It's not like Russia has many more options for getting in and out of the Baltic Sea either. As War on the Rocks notes, the Baltic Sea is accessible via a trio of choke points. One of them is the Skagerrak, which is the location of Skagen Red. The other is Kattegat. Both are controlled by NATO nations, with Norway and Sweden adding to the Danish presence. If those two countries follow Denmark's lead, Shadow Fleet ships are severely limited in their options. Even worse for Russia, the outlet says, all east and northbound ships in the Baltic Sea have to pass by Denmark's Bornholm Island. That island is relevant to what Denmark is doing in the Baltic for a different reason. More on that later in the video. Now, these types of obstructions represent the very last thing that Putin wants to be happening in the Baltic Sea, because the Shadow Fleet is absolutely essential to Russia's ability to continue the Ukraine war. That's evident from the sheer amount of money that Russia has invested in these old vessels. Despite the ships that compromise the Shadow Fleet being near or even beyond their intended lifespans, they still cost money. According to Craig Kennedy's Navigating Russia, Putin has plowed $14 billion into buying Shadow Fleet ships since May 2022. This has been great for some unscrupulous European and American ship owners. A sprawling follow the money investigation reports finding they've collectively made at least $6.3 billion out of Putin's desperation. It seems unlikely that the West is going to be able to do anything about the sale of these types of ships at the source. Measures like what Denmark is introducing can at least ensure Russia wastes its money after buying a shady ship. Putin has spent all of this money for a reason. As Jamie Shea of Friends of Europe notes, oil is one of Russia's most profitable exports. Last year, Shea says, referring to 2024, the Kremlin pulled in $16.4 billion from oil sales to finance its war effort in Ukraine. That was 5% more than in 2023. These oil sales allow Moscow to stabilize the ruble, control its budget deficit, and keep its balance of payments in credit so that it has money to pay for its imports. The Shadow Fleet is instrumental to ensuring Russia can balance the books, not just for the Ukraine war, but in terms of Russia's entire economy. The UK government adds that its July 2025 sanctions against 135 of the oil tankers that make up the Shadow Fleet are supposed to target a group of vessels responsible for transporting $24 billion of cargo since the beginning of 2024. That amounts to an approximate annual revenue of $16 billion for Russia, which more than justifies the $14 billion Putin has invested into the Shadow Fleet. The EU is also sanctioning ships. About 444 of Russia's Shadow Fleet ships are already blacklisted, with another 120 vessels likely to be added as part of the EU's latest round of sanctions. Barriers against Russia's Shadow Fleet are being put all over the place via sanctions. Now, Denmark is creating a literal barrier, and any shady ship that tries to pass through the Skagen Red is going to be in its crosshairs. Some might argue that this level of scrutiny within the Baltic Sea should have been applied a long time ago. Perhaps they would have a point. It's easy to interpret Denmark's decision to strengthen its inspections as an acknowledgement that it wasn't doing enough to stop Shadow Fleet ships in the past. However, it's possible that Denmark has been pushed into action by a series of recent incidents, indicating that it's not just Ukraine that is being threatened by Russia and its military ambitions. Denmark is on Putin's radar too. Just a few days before Denmark announced its new initiative, Reuters carried out a report on several Russian naval provocations that have occurred in the various straits that Denmark controls. These provocations included Russian warships purposely sailing on collision courses with other ships and the aiming of weapons at Danish naval vessels. Russian ships have also been activating GPS jamming equipment to hinder other vessels. Denmark's Defense Intelligence Service Director, Thomas Arenkiel, revealed all at an October press conference. He revealed that one Russian warship had been anchored in Danish waters for over a week, likely to serve as a constant threatening presence against Denmark and any other vessel that might pass by. We've seen several incidents in the Danish Straits where Danish Air Force helicopters and naval vessels have been targeted by tracking radars and physically pointed at with weapons from Russian warships, Arenkiel said. He added, Russia is using military means, including in an aggressive way, to put pressure on us without crossing the line into armed conflict in a traditional sense. So, Russia is going to use unconventional means to threaten Denmark. What better response than one that Russia would never have seen coming? Rather than attempting to intimidate Russia right back, Denmark is exercising a right that it's always had to indirectly hurt the Russian military in a way that Putin could never have expected. Diminishing the effectiveness of the Shadow Fleet in any way will weaken Russia's military. That's the entire purpose of sanctions. Now, with its increased ship inspections, Denmark has found a novel way to overcome a uniquely Russian problem. That's not to say that Denmark isn't doing other things to limit Russia's impact and presence in the Baltic Sea. In addition to the unconventional, it has more traditional ways of letting Russia know that it means business. Denmark's stronger inspections are just part of a wider Baltic plan that will see it strike back against Russia in several ways. getting ready is one of those ways. In September, the Danish defense website reported that Denmark was among 14 nations that took part in a Baltic Sea maritime exercise named Northern Coasts. The country sent one of its frigates and all of its mine clearance vessels to take part in an exercise where it trained for tactical maritime warfare in coastal waters. Part of the exercise focused on ensuring free navigation through the Baltic Sea for all vessels that Russia might try to target with its hybrid warfare, which shows Putin that he'll have a lot more to worry about than stringent Shadow Fleet inspections if he tries to push Denmark too far. Back in June, Denmark also announced that it was going to deploy floating Sally drones into the Baltic Sea. These unmanned vessels, which are made by a company based in California, look like sailing boats but are really data collection hubs. They're loaded with sensors, cameras and radars that, when combined with onboard artificial intelligence, allow them to depict a more detailed image of maritime activity than other surveillance methods, such as satellite navigation. These Sally drones might allow Denmark to identify more Shadow Fleet ships, especially those that are involved in the attempted destruction of undersea cables in the Baltic Sea, The Guardian reports. Oh, and remember that island mentioned earlier in the video, the one that all east and northbound ships have to sail by to pass in or out of the Baltic Sea? That scrap of land is called Bornholm Island, and it's going to start serving as much more than a lookout point. On September 8, the Nordic Reporter said that Denmark is building up a military presence on this small island. Dubbed the Bornholm Regiment, this presence is the 10th such unit created as part of the Danish army, and it will contain between 500 and 900 personnel. They'll be equipped with 15 Patria 6x6 armoured personnel vehicles, each of which can hold up to 10 soldiers. This new regiment will also add to the force of around 200 people that Denmark has stationed at Bornholm Island in the past. This may not seem like a huge move on its own, however, Denmark doesn't have a particularly large military. Right now, its military only has around 23,000 active personnel, though Denmark has plans to increase this number to 28,000 by 2033. Sending around 1,000 soldiers to a single island demonstrates that Denmark is taking its Baltic Sea responsibilities extremely seriously. The militarization of Bornholm Island may be minor when taken in isolation, but when combined with everything else that Denmark is doing in the Baltic Sea, it's one more piece of a massive puzzle that involves all of NATO. And Russia can't really do a thing about any of this. Everything that Denmark is doing, from its inspections to its increased Baltic Sea militarization, is being done on Denmark's territory. It has the right to do all of this, and it's working under international and EU frameworks to hinder Russia's Shadow Fleet. It remains to be seen how effective Denmark's new inspection-based strategy is for dealing with Shadow Fleet ships. They won't stop Putin's ancient vessels on their own, but the extra pressure is always going to be a problem for Putin, a problem that he isn't going to solve. Instead, Putin is forced to rely on hybrid warfare and indirect attacks against NATO, all of which will only fuel more responses like the ones Denmark is making in the Baltic Sea. Now, the real reason why Russia is secretly attacking NATO becomes clear. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show if you want to watch more videos covering what's happening in the Baltic Sea.